Hello and welcome to the first instalment of WMT Reviews 12 Nights of Halloween. Now, I was a coward when I was younger. I had a very overactive imagination, and as a result, I was terrified of everything. The dark, forests, cemeteries, dogs, heights, you name it. And now I'm a lot older, I can safely say that I'm not afraid of dogs anymore. But more to the point, I stayed well away from horror movies for a very long time. As a matter of fact, I didn't watch my first horror movie until I was 18, and going through the same phase that all charming young men do at that age, a fascination with mass murder. No? Just me. Well, that's worrying. But I digress. I was naturally thrilled when I ran the randomizer to find out which movie would be the first in this year's 12 Nights of Halloween, as it also contained my first ever horror movie icon, that being the scorched serial slayer Freddy Krueger, and the film franchise that he calls home, A Nightmare on Elm Street. Elm Street first hit the theatres in 1984, the brainchild of horror movie mastermind Wes Craven, and it was a universal success. Everything from the look and feel of the settings to the dark twists and turns of the plot, and of course the stellar performance of Robert Englund in the role of Mr. Krueger himself. It was the film that made teenagers everywhere afraid to get back into bed, and though the franchise grew camper and camper as more and more sequels were drained from the rapidly drying sponge of the original concept, leading to a controversial remake in 2010, the original 1984 classic is still today considered to be one of the greatest horror movies of all time. So, let's kick this October off Freddy style. This is the WMT review of Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street. So, what's the story? In the town of Springwood, Ohio, a group of teenagers are tormented in their dreams by a malevolent figure wielding a four-bladed gauntlet and a horribly disfigured face. It all seems like harmless dreams until teens start dying from injuries sustained during these dramatic nightmares. As Nancy, played by Heather Langenkamp, and her boyfriend Glenn, played by a very young Johnny Depp, start to investigate, they begin to uncover a conspiracy fabricated by their parents, whereby this nighttime stalker is in fact the vengeful spirit of child murderer Fred Krueger, who was in turn killed by their parents in revenge for the children he had killed. Struggling against her parents' denial and battling her own fears that she may just be going crazy, Nancy finally builds up the courage to face Freddy directly, dragging him into the real world and defeating him by overcoming her fear of him, rendering him powerless. I think what makes Elm Street work as one of the greats of horror is the fact that it plays on very simple fears. Isolation, helplessness, not being able to trust your parents, the fear of someone harming your children. All these simple fears are explored and highlighted, and a big part of that comes from a major development in every young person's life, that being puberty. Now, people say that everyone reacts to puberty differently, and Elm Street explores almost every reaction to that kind of sudden personal development and turns it back on itself into a horror scenario. For instance, sexuality is portrayed very violently. The death of Tina, for instance, take place in bed, and the actions and motions are strongly indicative of a violent rape scenario. The famous bath sequence when Freddy's bladed glove rises from the water is also indicative of this, as a young teenager would no doubt feel very vulnerable and exposed while bathing. So, let's talk about what everyone remembers about this movie, the villain, Freddy Krueger, played brilliantly by Robert Englund. In my opinion, Freddy was never scarier than he was in the original Nightmare. The element of mystery was well conveyed by the fact that he's so often hidden in the shadows, and you can very rarely make out any of his facial details, until later in the film when more is understood about him. Freddy was originally intended to be a child molester instead of a child murderer, but the change was made so that the film didn't appear to be taking advantage of recent molestation cases in the public eye. But even so, Freddy's weapon, the iconic bladed glove, is a fantastic visualization of the molester he was intended to be. The idea that even the slightest touch could leave a permanent scar on his victims. This was an idea which was returned to with mixed results in the 2010 remake. But there is, of course, another side to this villain, the sadistically humorous and playful side. He takes a tremendous amount of joy in what he does, chuckling as he gradually terrifies his victims one scare at a time, gaining momentum with every scream, building up the tension till the thrill of the final kill. All of this comes through in Englund's energetic physical and vocal performance. His laugh is always the right laugh, be it a sinister chuckle or a wild and roaring cackle. His movements are fluid and dreamlike, allowing him to blend almost seamlessly into any scene. Visually, the film does very well to blur the lines between the dream world and the real world. It's often very difficult to tell when a character has fallen asleep and when they are awake, meaning that Freddy can appear at almost any time, adding to the suspense and making it very difficult for the viewer to relax. The boiler room motif is very effective, as it too plays on some very basic fears: the fear of the basement, the boiler room, the dark area of your house or your school where the creepy janitor spends all day, the industrialized pipes and the sudden bursts and hisses of steam. It creates a claustrophobic environment that can feel very difficult to escape from. Again, these are all incredibly simple fears which are played upon perfectly. The trust or lack thereof between Nancy and her parents is another big tension point in the film, as a visualization of the struggles of puberty and the fears of the unknown. You would like to think that the first person you could turn to would be your parents, so it makes the whole situation feel more isolated and therefore more frightening when you realize that not only do your parents not believe you, but are in fact hiding the truth from you. I mean, Nancy's mother goes so far as to convince her own daughter that she's crazy, just to cover up her own guilt before finally admitting what she did to Krueger. And Nancy is naturally hostile in her reaction to the lies. The death scenes are just as creative and visually impressive as you would expect from the golden age of slasher films. From Tina's frantic and bloody demise to Rod's jail cell hanging, and of course the one everyone remembers, Johnny Depp being dragged into his bed before gallons of blood rise to the ceiling and pour out across the roof. One of the greatest movie deaths of all time. And because this was the first time we were seeing anything like this, it all worked so well. The use of practical effects and makeup will always be scarier than anything a computer can generate. And I still think that the horror genre as a whole was all but ruined with the heavy application of those resources in modern movies. Nightmare came from a time when all the current effects were at their best, before the allure of the green screen set in and coated everything in that unnatural shine. I have to admit, the film does struggle to hold my attention during one scene in particular, close to the film's climax. After bringing Freddy through to the real world, Nancy springs a variety of Home Alone-esque traps, resulting in various slapstick moments that would also plague later films in the Elm Street series, as well as movies like Scream. I know the scene was intended to portray Nancy using her intelligence and her cunning to overcome her enemy, but it doesn't really amount to anything, and it doesn't stop Freddy from coming after her. It's only after she realizes that she has to let go of her fear of him that she's able to defeat him, making that entire scene feel like a vague form of comic relief. Oh, we got a sledgehammer in the nuts. That's funny in the middle of a genuinely scary film. But even that scene included the great moment on the stairs when Nancy starts to sink into them with each step, playing on the common dream trait of not being able to run away from your antagonist. With such a young cast, you'd expect the acting to be a tad flawed and wooden in some areas, but Nightmare benefits from a standout cast of great young talent. After all, this was the movie that began the long career of Johnny Depp, one of Hollywood's most popular modern actors. It doesn't suffer from the usual horror movie cast of talentless unknowns going up against one starring villain who either doesn't speak at all or is some kind of monster on a puppeteer's strings. And this only serves to add to the vibrance and life of the characters. There may not have been a scorched serial killer stalking our nightmares, but everyone watching this film has gone through the changes of puberty and can therefore normally find something or someone to relate to. Nightmare on Elm Street was quite rightfully a massive hit when it first came out, and it continues to hold up even by today's standards as a gripping horror flick, creating one of the most iconic slasher movie villains of all time, spawning a franchise that has flourished for over 30 years and continues to bring audiences back to the very beginning in search of that same thrill once again. It's a fantastic example of a great idea fully realised on the big screen. And for that, I'm going to award A Nightmare on Elm Street a resounding 8.5 on the Orsometer. It's a fantastically thrilling flick with a cast you'll actually want to see make it to the end, a villain you'll never forget, and moments that will live in cinema history forever. So that's an 8.5 on the Awsometer for Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street. I've been Wiseman Tanofsky, this has been WMT Reviews 12 Nights of Halloween, and I will see you tomorrow. Thank you very much for listening.